Polar Bear Explorers Club, Chapter 4. How come you're looking after the wolves anyway? Stella asked Shay as the two of them set about properly securing the canvas walls of the kennel. Dad says a proper explorer should always see to his animals before seeing to himself, he replied. Seems only fair. Besides, it's easier for me because I speak their language. He pulled the silver wolf pendant free from his shirt, and Stella realised that it was no ordinary pendant at all, but a whisperer's wolf, a magical clockwork creature. You're a wolf whisperer, she said. Felix had told her about whisperers, amazing people who could speak to animals but who were quite rare, and hardly anyone was born with the gift these days. Felix had once met a man who claimed to be a frog whisperer and carried a small frog around with him in a box, telling anyone who would listen that it was a genius who could solve all the problems of the civilised world. But the frog seemed very uninterested in whatever conversation the man was trying to have with it, and Felix wasn't convinced that he was really a frog whisperer at all. "Can I see the wolf?" Stella asked, a little breathlessly. The ship gave another rolling lurch and she grabbed hold of a rope to steady herself. Sure. Shay slipped the pendant from around his neck and dropped it into Stella's palm. The animal had been sitting up with its eyes closed, but as soon as it touched her skin, it lay down on her hand in one quick movement, its nose between its paws. The silver was warm, and Stella could feel the soft thump of a tiny heartbeat deep within it. Animals like these were only given to whisperers who'd been rigorously tested and vetted and verified by the Royal Guild of Whisperers. Otherwise, there was nothing to stop any old person from putting a frog in a box and claiming that he could speak to it. How does being a whisperer work? Stella asked. I just think whatever I want to say in my mind, and the wolves hear me, Shay said with a shrug. And then they speak back to me inside my head too. Like this. Look. Shay turned his head towards the nearest wolf pen, and although he didn't speak out loud, Stella could tell he was talking to one of the wolves because the wolf pendant in her hand moved. The silver wolf opened its eyes, which were revealed to be tiny red jewels that gleamed in the lamplight. Stella saw a nearby wolf, the reddish one she'd saved earlier, suddenly prick up its ears, raise its head and look straight at Shay. She says thanks a bunch for helping her earlier, Shay said, turning to Stella. She thought you were very brave. I did too. Stella shrugged, although she couldn't help being pleased by the compliment. Wish I was a wolf whisperer, she said, handing the pendant back. Or any kind of whisperer, really. A polar bear whisperer would definitely be her first choice. She could have proper conversations with Gruff then, and she was quite sure he would have plenty of fascinating opinions to share and interesting things to say. The ship was rolling hard enough to send her sprawling, so Stella sat down on the nearest haystack. Have you ever been to the Royal Guild of Whisperers? She asked. Shay nodded as he replaced the whisperer's wolf around his neck and joined her on the haystack. Yep. Mum took me when I was tested, he said, settling into a cross-legged position. They had an entire cabinet there with pendants for different animals. Some of them were pretty unusual, like the duck-billed platypus. And there was sheep and a sloth and a mole, he went on, counting them off on his fingers, and a ferret and a duck. And I don't think duck whispering would be very useful, though, really. About as useful as frog whispering, Stella replied. And there was a yeti, of course. A flash of lightning suddenly lit up the wolf pen, and in those few seconds, Stella clearly saw the dark silhouette of a wolf flash by on the other side of the canvas wall. Oh, she leapt to her feet. Oh no, there's still a wolf out there. She was already heading for the exit, horrified at the thought of the poor animal being swept overboard, when Shay caught hold of her arm. Stella noticed that he wore several bracelets, woven from chocolate-coloured leather, many of them fastened with beads the shape of wolf heads. Hold your horses, he said. That's just Koa. Koa? She's my shadow wolf. Stella stared at him. What's a shadow wolf? Shay tilted his head and one side of his mouth quirked upwards in a half smile. Well, he said, that's a good question. No one quite knows for sure. Most whisperers have them. Some people think they're a kind of guardian angel sent to protect the whisperer. Others believe that the shadow animal is a wild part of the whisperer's own soul, brought to life and given physical form. He drew back the canvas wall so that Stella could see out onto the shiny wet deck. Through the driving rain, a dark shape moved slowly towards them, and as it got closer, Stella saw that it was an enormous wolf. It wasn't like the wolves in the pen, though. This one was larger, reaching almost to Stella's waist, and its fur was coal black, the exact same shade as Shay's own hair. When it stopped in front of them, Stella saw that the wolf had intelligent silver eyes that seemed to glow with a faint light all of their own. Shay dropped down into a crouch so that his face was level with the wolf's. The animal gazed back at him with obvious affection. Is she friendly? Stella asked. Can I stroke her? Oh, she's friendly all right, Shay replied, but she has no physical substance. She's a shadow wolf, remember? He demonstrated by reaching out his hand and bringing it slowly towards Koa's back. Instead of making contact with the fur, his hand just passed straight through the wolf's body, like the animal was made of smoke. And indeed, the next moment, Koa melted away into the shadows, as if she'd never been there. Where's she gone? Stella asked, gazing around. Shay shrugged. Who knows? He looked up. Koa comes and goes as she pleases. I don't always see her, but I feel her close by. She's never too far away. What kind of things does she say to you? Stella asked, desperately curious. Secrets, mostly. I couldn't possibly share them. She'd never forgive me. Shay offered her a grin. Sorry. That's okay, Stella replied. The fairies told Felix secrets sometimes, and he had explained to her that it was very important to never betray a friend's trust by sharing a confidence. Were you born a wolf whisperer? Stella asked, or was Koa just there one day? She very much hoped it was the second option. If Shay's shadow wolf had just suddenly appeared, then perhaps Stella might yet turn out to be a whisperer. While she might wake up in her cabin tomorrow only to find a shadow unicorn or a shadow polar bear peering up at her. Really, even a shadow caterpillar or a shadow duck would be better than nothing. But Shay said, You're born a whisperer. Koa's been there for as long as I can remember. He paused, then added, She saved my sister's life once. I've 7 of them, you know. He gave Stella another sudden grin. Sisters, that is, not shadow wolves. My youngest sister is a penguin whisperer. How absolutely wonderful, Stella exclaimed. Shay shrugged. It's okay, I guess. But her shadow penguin, Honky, is terribly grumpy. He and Koa get on famously, though. Honky likes to stand on Koa's back and ride about on her whilst flapping his wings up and down. Stella couldn't help giggling at this image. Just at that moment, though, a gigantic thunder crack overhead made both children jump. I'd better go, Stella said reluctantly. She thought of the promise she'd made earlier and added, Felix said I had to go back to the cabin if the storm hit. Will the wolves be okay? Shay nodded. I'll stay with them, he said, and Koa will keep an eye out, all night long if we have to. Well, good night then. Good night, Sparky, and thanks again for your help. You are marvellous. When Stella woke up the next morning, the ship was already in the harbour at Coldgate. From her top bunk, she peered out of the porthole and marvelled at the beautiful white sails of the other ships. Stella, why on earth are your clothes all wet? Felix asked from below. Stella winced and peered over the side of the bunk. She'd been so keen to change into her unicorn pyjamas last night that she'd just left her wet clothes in a pile by the bed. I was helping Shay Kipling look after the wolves, she said, and the ship was rocking around so much that I fell into the water trough. It was only half a lie after all, and there was no reason to upset Felix unnecessarily. Stella noticed that he had put on his explorer's hooded dress cloak. It was made from pale blue cloth with a small polar bear stitched on the front, clearly marking him out as a member of the Polar Bears Explorers Club. Stella had seen the cloak many times before, but normally only hanging on a coat peg or thrown over the back of a chair. Felix hated it for being heavy and itchy and too formal, and was forever taking it off as soon as he got the first chance. They left the ship and stepped onto a harbour bustling with people. Many of them seemed to be selling weird and wonderful things, from mermaid flowers and pirate pancakes to treasure maps and telescopes. Stella would love to explore, but there wasn't even time to have breakfast. The other members of the expedition had already left to arrange their final supplies, and Felix and Stella were the last to get going. A sleigh had been sent for them from the Polar Bear Explorers Club, ornate and beautiful, adorned with dozens of silver bells and the explorers' crests painted on the side. And stamping their pearly hooves and snorting their misted breath into the frosted morning air were 6 magnificent zebra unicorns. Stella and Felix boarded the sleigh and set off into Coldgate, the many tiny bells creating a constant backdrop of silver music. The entire city was made from ice, and dozens of ice towers sparkled as the sleigh rattled along the frozen cobbles. Stella was quite sure it must be one of the most beautiful places in the world. Everything was bright white in the morning sunshine, with ice sculptures and frozen fountains marking every corner. In no time at all, they'd reached the gates of the Polar Bear Explorers Club, topped with gold-tipped spikes. There were also glorious polar bear statues, crafted from white marble, reclining on the pillars at either end. The gates swung open for them, and the sleigh passed down a central path, flanked on each side by a vast snow garden. There were ice sculptures designed to look like an entire forest of trees, and Stella glimpsed ice polar bears between the tree trunks. But even the lovely ice garden couldn't compare with the magnificent building that housed the club itself. It was, officially, the largest igloo in the known world. But rather than being constructed from ice, it was made entirely of white marble, shot through with silver veins that sparkled in the sun. And instead of the usual smooth, round roof, this igloo had dozens of white brick chimneys, all of which were busily puffing out wood smoke from the many great fires the club kept burning day and night. The sleigh pulled right up in the front entrance, and liveried staff seemed to appear out of nowhere. A man with very white gloves held out a silver tray with steaming cups of hot chocolate on it, and Felix passed one to Stella before taking one for himself. The hot chocolate butler was clearly expecting Felix to go into the club alone, because he suddenly looked quite alarmed when Felix helped her down from the sleigh and said, "Right then, we better go and announce ourselves." Sir?" "Yes, Parsons? It's just that, your companion is, He glanced nervously at Stella. "Yes? It's just that she's a girl, sir." Felix gazed at Stella for a moment, as if only just seeing her for the first time. Then he gave a shrug and said, "So she is. Well, there you have it. Not much we can do about that now, I dare say." "But, sir, girls aren't permitted in the Polar Bear Explorers Club," the hapless footman said. "Aren't they?" Felix said, as if it was the first time he'd heard of it. "It's forbidden, sir." "That's all right, Parsons. I'll take the responsibility," Felix said in a polite but firm voice. He held his hand out to Stella, who normally considered herself too grown up for hand-holding, but she was starting to feel a little bit intimidated by the club and its disapproving footman, and she took Felix's hand and was glad that he gave her fingers a reassuring squeeze. Together they went through the huge double doors and into the club's front entrance. It was a thoroughly grand affair, with the most gigantic fireplace Stella had ever seen dominating the far wall. The air smelled of pine needles, and the walls were made of the same white marble bricks as the exterior. All around the room hung huge portraits of the Polar Bear Explorers Club's most famous and esteemed members, who peered out at them with extremely serious expressions on their faces. They were all men, of course, and they all seemed to have a penchant for monocles and morose moustaches. The floor was also white marble, and it was scattered about with thick, warm rugs, intricately stitched in silver and blue. But one of them wasn't man-made, and Stella and Felix both winced at the sight of a huge polar bear rug spread out in the centre of the room. It still had its entire head, and the mouth had been fixed open to display its teeth, its sightless eyes glaring blindly ahead. Stella thought of Gruff and his love of hugs and fish biscuits and rolling in the snow, and turned her head away from the sad, skinned bear on the floor. Her eyes instantly fell on a gigantic pair of snow moose antlers displayed over the fireplace. Another trophy brought back from some past expedition. The animal skins and rugs and antlers made Stella feel very sad, and she thought she might have preferred the entrance hall of the Jungle Cat Explorers Club, which was said to be adorned with hundreds and hundreds of piranha teeth. The footmen took their cloaks and said, "If you'd care to follow me, I'll announce you to the president." Stella and Felix followed him down a corridor, their footsteps muffled by the many thick rugs, although thankfully there were no more polar bear ones. Finally, they stopped in front of a large red door that led to the club president's study. There was a brass nameplate on the door that read, "Algernon Augustus Fogg, Club President." Felix indicated some ornate, uncomfortable-looking chairs and said, "Best wait out here, Stella. The old boy is a bit of a stick in the mud, and it would be better if I could warm him up to the idea of you slowly." Stella sighed, but sat down on one of the chairs. The footman duly announced Felix, who smiled at her before disappearing into the room on the other side of the door. With a final worried look in Stella's direction, the footman left as well, leaving her alone in the corridor. She fidgeted about for a while, trying to get comfortable, but the seat was lumpy and smelled funny, as if a wet polar bear had rubbed its fur up against her. For what felt like the longest time, Stella strained her ears, trying to catch a few words of the conversation that was taking place in the other room. She didn't hear anything except for when a voice that wasn't Felix's exclaimed, "Absolutely out of the question!" She flinched and knew they must be talking about her. An hour went by and still Felix hadn't come out. Stella got up, paced about a bit and looked up and down before finally deciding that she couldn't possibly sit in that lumpy old chair a moment longer. She was in the Polar Bear Explorers Club, so if Felix wasn't persuasive enough and the president was about to have her thrown out, then Stella was going to make absolutely sure that she at least got to see the map room before she left. She figured it couldn't be that difficult to find, and so with one last guilty look at the club president's door, she turned her back on it and walked away down the corridor.